Today I'm back with some scary camping stories featuring hoofed monsters, assailants in the dark, and what goes down in the woods when the fire goes out. Before we start, I have a quick update. I removed my previous upload titled Creature on the Railroad 4 True Horror Stories because I wanted to separate the stories in that video into different episodes. That's because the final story featured a different format of storytelling that I thought would fit best in its own video. So, to clear things up, the first 3 stories from that video I took down are now featured at the end of this video here, and the final story of that video is now featured in its own episode titled Abigail's Story. So, all stories are still here on my channel. So be sure to like and share this video, comment below, and send me your scary stories at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. Thing in the Woods from Bat. I don't think you should necessarily be afraid of the dark, but you should definitely be aware of your surroundings when nighttime comes around, or you might just encounter something very unpleasant. Despite all the bad things going on in the world, my mom and I decided it'd be a good idea to go on a camping trip in northern Ontario, Canada. When she told me about the campsite, I just couldn't say no. I love the outdoors. We invited our friend, let's call her Phoenix. She was more than enthusiastic to tag along. On July 7th, we set off. It was a long, tiring trip, but the landscapes were breathtaking nonetheless. After 5.5 hours of driving, we made it. I was so happy to get out of that car. The first few days were perfect. We had lots of fun fishing, swimming, and hiking the trails. The weather was great too. It was like a dream come true. Though, after a while, we started to hear strange noises at night, usually while we were in our tent. My mother and Phoenix just brushed it off as an animal in the woods, but I felt uneasy. It didn't sound like a normal animal. It sounded human. But there was no logical reason for someone to be in the woods past midnight, right? I should mention that we were in a pretty remote area. We only had one neighbor beside us the whole time. They were on the right side and the noises were coming from the left. A few times by the campfire we'd hear the same noises, feet scattering around in those woods. When I flashed my flashlight toward the noises, there was nothing. The second last night, me and my mom and Phoenix put out the fire and turned in for the night. I did a lot that day, so I had no trouble falling asleep. It was peaceful, until I woke up to someone walking around outside. At first, I thought it was one of my campmates, but when I looked over, I saw them both fast asleep. I shifted around a bit, and I must have scared them off because they ran back into the woods. I was too freaked out to even say anything, so I just lay there in silence. I couldn't hear the person anymore. I found myself falling back to sleep, which was a dumb idea, because there could have been a murderer out there. I woke up a second time to the same noise, but it was closer. I nudged my mom gently and pointed towards the sound. She mumbled something about a raccoon and fell back asleep. The noise suddenly just stopped. I shut my eyes and hid under the covers. After a few moments of complete silence, I felt a hand grab my leg. I screamed louder than I ever had before, waking up Mom and Phoenix. I kicked as hard as I could. I must have hit it, because whatever it was let out a loud grunt. It was a very animalistic grunt. At first, it just stood there. I could see it illuminated by the moonlight. I saw hooves and antlers like a deer, but it was standing on 2 legs. It was so tall and thin, thank God it eventually ran away, because I was sure it was going to hurt me. We packed everything except our tent and sped out of there, despite it being the middle of the night. My mom called 911 and told them what happened. They had police officers go out there and check the area. One officer even followed behind us until we left the park to make sure we were safe. They found nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I was way too scared even though I was in my own house. I'm just glad we got out of there alive, even if we were terrified. I always keep my guard up, and I'll never be going back to that place. Not after that night. I haven't even gone camping at all since. Always be mindful of the things around you, and be careful of what could be lurking in the dark. Camp Get Out, from Darkly Dead 12. This event happened on August 2nd, 2019. I've no idea what we encountered, and I'm sharing not only to warn others, but also to get some information about what we might have seen. Feel free to judge for yourself, or even give out pointers as to what it is you think we met. Without further ado, I'll begin. It was the morning of August 2nd. For 2 days by then, me and my significant other, who I'll refer to as SO, had been camping far inland from Mueller State Park, a fair bit from Green Mountain Falls, right on the edge of Crystal Creek located in central Colorado. It was a remote location which needed a good hike to get to. We had our tent set up at the edge of a circular clearing in the woods, which had about a 10-meter diameter, with trees enclosing all sides except for a small break where a path was. As I got out of the tent, my SO was sitting just outside, sniffing the air. She complained about it smelling of blood, so I took a big whiff. The air was heavy with ozone, and overpoweringly coppery. Probably a prefix to a storm, I said. We thought nothing more of it, and began preparing our tent ration breakfast. About 6 hours later in the afternoon, we decided we wanted to make a proper fire. Making sure our tent was sealed up, we opted to forage in the woods for appropriate kindling and decently sized stones to reflect the heat. We were only about 45 meters from camp when odd things started to happen. At this point, the coppery smell was completely faded, and so when it came back suddenly, we noticed it right away. The air grew heavy as the smell became overpowering. Me and my SO both tried to cover our noses with our shirts, but it really didn't help. We continued collecting for the fire, fighting through the urge to gag on the smell. A few minutes later, we began to hear something. Maybe 10 meters away from us, there was rushing like an animal moving quickly, and also this strange noise. It sounded like someone or something jittering their voice while mid-laugh. If you want a reference to this, try Peter Griffin's laugh, only it was monotone, deeper, and almost distorted, like it was coming from strained vocal cords. The animal was fast, and it seemed to be darting around in the undergrowth right beyond our eyesight. From the way the brush moved and the sound, it seemed large, too. My SO was terrified, and so was I. I was seriously afraid of a potentially dangerous and weird-sounding animal. We began to walk quickly back to the camp, preparing to drop our stones and wood to run if necessary. The noise seemed to always stay close by, but never close enough to see what was making it. As we got into the clearing, it seemed to stop altogether. We were both very shaken, but assumed it to be an animal we didn't have much experience with. We didn't lose much of our material in the rush back, so we began to assemble a small fire pit. The rest of the afternoon was uneventful, and when it came night, we headed inside before it got too dark. A while after we fell asleep, maybe around 2 in the morning, my SO got up, and I awoke too as I heard them crawling out of the tent. When they got outside, they began yelling, "Babe, come here! What are you doing?" This chilled me to the bone, as I was obviously right behind her in the tent. I turned my phone's flashlight on and called her name. She turned around, and when she saw me, her face turned white. "What? How? You're inside. You just called my name from outside the tent, though." She grew even more pale and began to shake, and I knew she was terrified. I quickly squatted up and pulled her inside the tent. "What are you talking about? I've been inside here the whole time. No one's out there." She looked visibly stricken with fear. "Harry, you're out there." I was beyond scared. She was completely convinced that someone who just sounded like me was calling to her from the woods. Despite being afraid, I knew I had to appear confident so I didn't heighten my partner's now extreme anxiety. I grabbed a flashlight and small hunting knife from my backpack. I really am not skilled with weapons, but I thought it might be intimidating enough to ward off whatever was out there, especially if it's just some folks trying to scare us for fun. I calmed her down, telling her everything would be fine and I'd go check. I left the tent, flashlight and knife in hand. I still regret not just staying there and sleeping the night away. When I exited the clearing, I did a quick scan with my flashlight. I saw nothing. Then, looking down, I noticed something odd. All the stones around the fire were moved, thrown about the camp clearing in seemingly random order. When I noticed this, I bent down to pick up one of the stones. It was extremely hot to the touch despite the fire being out for hours. As I kneeled examining the stone, the copper smell suddenly filled my nostrils again, far, far stronger than any time previous, and I heard a voice from right in front of me in the darkness, opposite the direction of our tent. In my exact voice, my inflection, something spoke the words I said to my SO seconds ago. Don't worry, everything is fine. A sudden cold came over me, the type of cold that washes over you when you knew you really messed up. Without thinking, I raised my flashlight. There stood the most horrific animal, if you could even call it that I'd ever seen. It was huge. I stand about 5'10" and this thing was at least 2 feet taller than me. It looked like an extremely decayed, tortured elk, but it had a far longer body, like that of a horse, and it was standing on 2 legs. Parts of its skin were missing, and it had the distinctive cervine skull formation. Its body was draped in a loose brown, dirty tarp, and it was extremely skinny, with skin and flesh missing around the ribs completely. I didn't dare examine it anymore. I began to inch backwards, breathless and nearly paralyzed, and then the beast suddenly emitted a blood-curdling, high-pitched scream. It sprinted out of the clearing. I heard leaves rustling and branches breaking for a good few minutes before it finally left earshot. Finally, I returned to the tent, trying to calm myself. My SO was on the verge of breaking down, and so naturally I didn't tell her the truth. I said I saw a deer in the camp and I must have scared it enough to let out a scream. I reiterated that there was nothing outside to be afraid of, and we both went to sleep, or tried to anyway. I'm pretty sure both of us spent the night pretending to rest, all the while terrified of every stray noise we'd hear outside the tent. As soon as daylight struck, we packed up and left, and as we did, I got a good look at the pattern the stones were in. They created a narrow arc that perfectly resembled a crescent moon, bending around where our tent was as its axis. Suffice to say, I never have been more terrified than that night in the woods. I still have no idea what I encountered, but maybe someone who hears this story will. Whatever it was I saw, I hope it's native to Crystal Creek, Colorado. If you happen to be planning a camping trip down there anytime soon, I'd pick somewhere else if I were you. Good luck, and stay safe. The Rocky Night That Changed My Life, from W_Wolf. My stepfather yelled from the ground floor, "George!" My stomach dropped, as it always did when I heard him bellow like that. I crept out of my room and stood at the top of the stairs. "George, get down here, now!" I slowly and quietly walked down the stairs, as if being delicate might save me from whatever trouble I was in this time. I reached the bottom, then turned the corner, and saw my stepfather, Richard, standing in the kitchen. The trash can was knocked over. Full food packages tossed around, opened and spilling onto the counter space and floor. The refrigerator was open. A carton of milk on its side was dripping. There was pasta and tomato sauce leftovers splattered on the linoleum. My shock was genuine, but I suppose he didn't see it. He had one culprit in his head, and it was the 13-year-old boy in pajamas standing in front of him. What ensued was an epic rant, even for the short-tempered Richard, who was making the mess worse as he exaggerated his frustration by tossing already wasted food, knocking over chairs, and even breaking a glass. It sounded as if he had worked out with his small thoughts exactly how I'd pulled off this culinary crime. I did what I always did in those situations. I stood still, staring straight ahead, trying to go anywhere else in my head. Anything to avoid further ire, lest I feel the violent, meaty hands of Richard. Through my mind, I saw the tree line just outside of our house. A half a mile or so, and there was my creek, where I spent countless hours in solitude during the day. I heard the water trickling over the rocks. I tried to imagine I was there listening to the wind in the trees, the dappled sun on my face. My vision was interrupted by Richard, who had moved within an inch of my face, asking his patented question. "Do you understand me?" "No, Richard, I don't." But I nodded yes. Richard always had a temper, but it was made worse when he was drunk, and I knew from his invasion of my personal space that he most definitely was. The sweet, acidic smell of cheap beer on his breath. Thank God he managed to consume his nightly six-pack before the kitchen was destroyed. "Clean it up. You've got 2 hours till your mother comes home. I want it spotless." Richard then slid away, stumbling like the man of distinction he was. I heard the TV turn on from the living room, and as always, turned up way too loud. Left to myself and not having to pander to Richard, I took the scene in. I knew I didn't destroy the kitchen because I did what I always did when my mom worked the late shift, and I was left with Dick. I stayed in my room reading comics and eating snacks. I then quickly jumped to the conclusion that Richard had done all of this, a sort of gaslighting that drunken stepfathers must take a class on. I stood there with each passing second. I heard the TV straining to operate at full volume, and I grew more furious. I imagined the creek again, this time at night, the water that moved over the big pile of rocks in the center as if, "I don't hear no cleaning." I had to get out of the house. I felt the walls closing in, my body running battery acid. I couldn't look at the cornflakes smashed on the floor or the orange juice dripping off the counter anymore, let alone clean it. I crept back upstairs to my room. I quickly changed into a pair of jeans and a hoodie, grabbing my backpack that was always equipped with a small tent that my mother had bought me shortly before meeting Richard. I crept back downstairs, my practice of stepping lightly coming in handy in times like this. I couldn't get out through the front door. He would hear that, but I could go through the side door in the kitchen. I made my way through the mess, and when I went to unlock the side kitchen door, I noticed it was already unlocked. Odd. This door was always locked, mostly because the deadbolt was sticky, and it took quite a bit of effort to work. It was a question I would ponder later. I opened the door as slowly and as minimally as I could, and I slipped out. The cool night wind met me immediately, and my knotted stomach began to loosen. I started towards the direction of the creek, my sanctuary. Our house then was mostly surrounded by fields, with a tree line about half a mile away. We had neighbors on each side, but no fences. This was closer to farm country, and acres of land between homes was only distinguished by mowing patterns in the grass. I'd run away before, sort of. Usually, I would only allow myself to meet the tree line, prop up the tent, and wait out whatever I was escaping. It was usually my mom that found me. She would come in with a soft, reassuring voice that would quell whatever I was seething over. But this night was different. I felt different. one of those moments that define your teenage angst as you test your individuality. I didn't want to be found. I was mad at Richard's latest stunt and his acrid breath. I was mad at my mom for being with him, for working the late shift and leaving me with that man who wasn't my father. I was mad at my real father, who left me before I knew him. I wanted to watch it all burn now. My veins were pumping lava. I remembered a gratifying feeling when I envisioned Richard bellowing from the living room, trying to compete with the TV, asking if the kitchen was spotless yet. Eventually, he'd stumble in, see the mess but not me. He'd scream and scream my name, maybe even bound up the stairs to get me from my room, but I wouldn't be there either. I remember smiling, genuinely feeling happy for a split second at his eventual dismay when he'd have to explain this all to my mom. There was no real trail to my spot by the creek, although I'd been there enough times to make some sort of path. The quickest way would require crawling over a fallen tree and pushing through a thick brush. I'd never done this at night, only in the daylight. You often hear things look different at night, and perhaps I should have been alert. But when I reached my spot, it was exactly how I'd envisioned it. The scattered moonlight highlighting the small stream, the sound of the trickling water over the mass of rocks in the center, the occasional hoot of an owl. Perhaps I should have been more on alert, but I wasn't. Considering the scene I'd just left, this solitude was welcomed. Nothing could be worse than being trapped in a house with Richard and that darn TV. I smiled. This all felt right, as if it was supposed to be here. Like I had listened to an unheard voice, flipped a switch, and I was now letting the universe guide me. I opened my bag and took out my tent, a small pop tent that I was able to get up in a flash. I crawled inside, leaving the flap down, so I could look at the water rushing over the rocks. I had gravitated towards this spot because it felt like something out of a movie. It was just so picturesque. Even to this day, despite what happened, I can still imagine it in my head. A small tuft of tall grass is where I propped my tent. A foot away was the craggy stream that jutted and banked in odd directions. Directly in the eyeline of my tent was a mound, maybe 4 or 5 feet in height, that was entirely composed of rocks that seemed impossibly smooth. They shimmered just below the constant thin covering of creek water. From time to time, there would be a smell. It would range from earthy, like dead leaves, to a sweet, pungent smell, like trash left in the sun. I must have been at my spot for half an hour or so, lost in a daze and trying to let my thoughts slow down, when I started to smell the creek. It started as dead leaves, but then quickly turned to a sharp odor, like when a mouse had died in my bedroom wall earlier that year. The breakdown of organic matter. It was so intense that I had to put my hand over my nose. I gagged, then pulled my hoodie up so it would cover half my face. I stared at the rock mound and saw reflections adjust at the very top, as if one of the rocks had shifted position. I thought it was the moonlight playing tricks on me, but then a small rock fell from the top of the mound, landing with a click-clack splash. Then I heard another one, then another. My heart skipped a beat. Something was moving just behind the mound. I then saw what looked like a twisted clump of twigs, leaves, and algae come rising over the mound. It then stopped on top of the biggest rock in the clump, near the top of the mound. In the night light, I felt like I started to see the silhouette of a person in the mound. The brush of twigs and algae formed the hair. The big rock on top, the head, its body made up of the other disconnected rocks, as if the form was sitting. Obviously, my mind was playing tricks on me, I thought. I knew there wasn't a person in the rocks, but once the image was in my mind, I couldn't unsee it. I sat there for what seemed like hours, just staring at the rocks, not daring to move. My body grew tired, and I realized I'd been tensed for as long as I'd been looking at the rock form. The smell was still prevalent, even through my thick hoodie, like dead mice and now what seemed like burnt hair. I thought of the voice that had led me out here, that internal voice which the universe was speaking through and radiated in my chest. Had it been betraying me? Something felt wrong. An owl called out with a ruckus hoot in full surround sound. This snapped me out of my daze, and I moved to zip up the entrance of my tent. I didn't think of running back to the house. I didn't want to leave myself exposed in such a way. That sort of irrational feeling of hope to just think whatever was out there wasn't looking at me. I sat in the tent, hearing the wind move through the trees, hearing the creek water trickle past. I heard what sounded like plastic crinkle, an unnatural sound in such a natural setting. I then saw something fly up against the tent and get caught on one of the corners, crinkling. Despite my fear, I slowly and quietly unzipped the tent flap. I cautiously peered out and held my breath. I saw a potato chip bag, Ruffles, lying against my tent, slowly moving in the wind. Had the kitchen not been destroyed, I wouldn't have thought anything of it perhaps, but my kitchen had been destroyed, and I'd eaten out of that very bag of sour cream and onion Ruffles that evening. Up until this point, you could perhaps chalk these deep-seated memories up to an overactive child imagination. I've replayed this story countless times in my head, and I've been able to find rationale in these events, until I heard more rocks fall. I turned from the potato chip bag and back to the mound, more rocks falling. Then suddenly, the bigger rocks that formed the majority of the mound began to move. The water sound changed, like when you stand up in a tub. Trickles became splashes as the rock form began to stand up. It was as if the rock form had been a person in waiting, simply sitting in the creek, letting the water roll over it in an ever-patient slumber. The earth mound form resembled that of a man, or at least that's what my mind made of it. It stood in the shallow creek, its shiny complexion dripping, its hair of algae and leaves protruding on top of its head. I sat in wonder, dumb, my body half out of the tent, not believing what I was witnessing. I then heard that darned owl hoot again, and reacting to it like a gunshot at a track meet, I attempted to sprint away. I slipped coming out of the tent and lost my left sneaker. I ran anyway. I ran on instinct, not fully conscious of the turns I was making, but somehow abiding by my loose trail directions. I slammed through the wall of brush, not even feeling the cuts loose sticks were giving me. I hopped the downed tree and let out a scream. My left foot had landed directly on a jagged rock. The pain, despite the adrenaline I had coursing, was too much. I stopped and held my foot, blood already gushing out. I looked back from where I came, hoping that I wasn't being followed. But I was. The rock form was pushing through the brush with ease. It made this flat thumping sound as it lurched, like when you drop a large stone on the sidewalk, cracking and heavy. I crawled as I heard the thump with greater and greater clarity. It was gaining. I grunted and got to my feet, where I continued to hobble through the brush. I could see the tree line, but I still heard the thump of the rock form. I dared to glance back behind me, and I saw the form extend an extremity back and lunge forward, stone hitting me just below the eye. It felt like a baseball bat swung at full force, connecting with my left cheek. It spun me around and dropped me to my knees, but I somehow continued to move. I scampered and got to the tree line, where I was glad to see, of all things, Richard, standing arms akimbo in the middle of the backyard. I let out a yell that sounded more like a squeal. He saw me crawling on the ground and bounded over. I turned behind me one last time and saw the rock form crumble. The algae hair dropped to the ground with a squish. The twigs scattered, the rocks forming a nondescript collection of nature. I turned back to look at Richard, frown-faced, slightly wobbling as he huffed and puffed in his gait. I looked back to the rocks, and in that moment knew no one would believe me. I knew there would be no way to spin this. The rock form, reduced to a pile, sat there, almost in mocking. Richard began screaming. He yelled because he didn't know what else to do. He didn't look at my face or judge my demeanor. He just lashed out. He demanded that I stand, but when I couldn't, he proceeded to drag me across the lawn, speaking in slurred tones. I remember seeing my neighbor's lights turn on. I may have seen some people from a distance on their back porches watching the scene unfold. This clearly drunk man dragging a child across the backyard. It culminated when he had dragged me nearly back to the house, and I was blinded by headlights pulling into the driveway. My mom had returned home from the late shift. Now I can just imagine the horror from her vantage point. Tired from a day's work and finding her husband dragging her only child through the backyard, covered in scratches with a brutal black eye forming. The night was then lost in a rush of loud voices, bright lights, and the reality of my new life. Police were called and drunk Richard was arrested. I was taken to the hospital where I needed 21 stitches in my foot, and I was diagnosed with a broken left cheekbone. I was lucky, I was told, and that I wouldn't require surgery for my facial fracture. Richard was blamed for everything, and while there were moments when I reveled in that, there were other times when I felt sorry. My mom never got a straight story out of me with regard to the events of that night. Even when I tried to tell the truth, it all came out jumbled. Years of futile therapy were ahead. I never returned to the woods, never saw my creek again. In the daylight, I would sometimes stare into the tree line, looking for the pile of rocks that had collapsed that night, but saw nothing. But I somehow knew that they had collected themselves and were sitting back in the creek, letting the water roll over them. I would have nightmares of that figure rising from the water, the sound of its heavy composite moving, the smell of dead mice. I thought of the destroyed kitchen, the potato chip bag that floated by my tent, the chase. I thought of the inner voice that led me there, that betrayed me, or so I thought, because in the end Richard was gone for good, which in so many moments was what I'd always wanted. I've dealt with these images in my head and the circumstances that led to that night, and I'm only left with questions. Had I manifested this, as so many therapists have suggested? Was there something larger out there granting my teenage whims, listening for my internal desires? Even now, years later, was it still there listening? I've learned to hold my dreams and never wish for something too hard. I believe there's something out there that I can't control, and I'll never uncover. A guardian angel who unfortunately wants to help. Railroad Creature from M.Turner. This occurred in eastern Kentucky, Letcher County to be exact. We own right around 2 acres. The house sits at the top of a slight hill, and it's about 1,000 feet from the door to the creek. Across the creek is the Appalachian Mountains, and at the base of them was the old logging railroad grade. Now, being the train fanatic I am, I've explored this bed several times looking for old spikes, and any remains that may have been left. It was ripped up over 60 years ago, so I've never found anything. This plays a vital role in my story. In the night, you can hear the river flow, see the fireflies, but other than that, it's just darkness. It was July 3rd when some cousins of mine came over. We were shooting some store-bought fireworks. We walked out about 500 feet into the yard, set up, and began. About 30 minutes into shooting, we set up the mortars. 1, 2, 3. We shot them off. Then we decided to do a 5-shot mortar. The first of the 5 went smoothly. Then our setup fell over, shooting one near us, one near our pool deck, and 2 into the mountains around 500 feet away from us. Startled, we all cleaned up, made sure nothing caught fire, and went back in. As we approached our glass sliding door, I thought I heard something in the hills. I'd heard little sounds before, and we had bears and coyote problems too, so I just assumed it was normal. Around an hour passed, and my cousins eventually left. We have a pool somewhat about 400 feet out from the house. There's a wooden walkway that leads directly to it. We had an extension cord ran out to run the pump, and with the recent thief problems in the area, I figured we'd need to bring it in just in case. As I approached the pool pump, I heard a scream that sounded like a woman. I know that panthers could sound close to that, but I wanted to be sure. So I strolled down to Creek Bank and I looked around. It was clear, but as I turned to go back, I heard the sound of a splash. My head jerked back around, and I caught a glimpse of something running on the old logging railroad bed. I scrambled on up the bank to our property and looked back. That's when something heavy smacked against my ankle. It was so painful, and it felt kind of sharp. As heavy and painful as it was, it didn't do as much damage as I first thought, so I sprinted back toward the house. Now, within a few feet from the door, I looked back down the slight grade towards the riverbed where I saw it. A skinny, hunched-over creature with long arms and a heavy-looking head. It stood across the river staring towards me. I couldn't see a color, just the silhouette as it swayed back and forth watching me. I reached into the house, grabbing a flashlight and shining it back towards the creek. It wasn't quite strong enough to shine all the way to the river, but what shook me the most was that the creature didn't seem to have eyes. I should have at least seen some eye glare of some kind, but nothing. I jumped in the house and slammed the door shut, locking it with the bars we had to secure the door tight. That night, I could not sleep. The following morning, I grabbed a blade I'd made and walked down to the river. I looked around, finding no trace of the creature, until I walked to where I stood at the top of the bank. I looked down at the ground, and there, before my feet, lay a rusty old railroad spike. As I mentioned above, I had never found a spike before. It had been decades since the railroad was even there. So, how did this one get here? That's when I made the connection. That something heavy and sort of sharp thing that hit me in the ankle last night. It was this. Did the creature throw it at me? Where did it get it? And how did it throw it that far? I picked it up, and on closer inspection, I noticed a splotch of dried blood near the head of it. It didn't bother me. I figured it was my own. I was intrigued with what the creature really was, though. A few hours passed, and I stood there brainstorming what it could have been. It dawned on me. Whatever hit me that night never cut me. After all, there was no blood on my ankle when I got back to the house. So if it wasn't my blood, whose was it? To this day, I've no clue what it was, what I saw that night. And it still bothers me. I just hope I never encounter it again. Creepy Attic. From Sicklin. This story takes place in a small town where I grew up. I've had other paranormal experiences before this, but this one I will always remember until the day I die. One winter day, my mother, my sister, and I moved into my newfound stepfather's house, about a mile off the road of any civilization. We're driving down the long and rocky road, going through two creeks that went throughout the driveway, and everything seemed normal. It was a cold and snowy day. Soon we made it to the house. The place was old and needed a lot of work, but I thought to myself this could be a very beautiful home. And it was, especially with nothing but land and woods around it. Fast forward several months. It's summer then. It was a hot summer day and everyone was in a good mood. We were all hanging out in my sister's room. I was playing on my phone, and my sister was playing Wii with my two cousins doing their own thing on their phones. The AC was blasting and we're all just chilling. I was facing the doorway, and straight out of the doorway, with a sheet covering both doorways at the time, was the stairs to the right of my sister's room. In the room was a door that we used for storage, and we considered it to just be something my stepdad had always put junk and stuff in, which would have been to my left, from where I was sitting, playing on my cell phone, an old Nokia, if you will. Anyway, pretty soon my mom called out, saying dinner was ready. Everyone but me got up and ran downstairs to get their plate, thanking my wonderful mother for making food. They were going to be a little while, so I hung back and waited for everyone else to get their food first, like the gentleman I've always tried to be. There I was alone in my sister's room, playing Snake 2 on what I thought was the coolest phone ever. When, to my left, where that storage attic door was, it slowly opened, and my eyes immediately turned to it. The house was old, so I shrugged it off like nothing even happened, but it was still very creepy nonetheless. A few moments go by and I keep looking at the door. After all, it had just opened with no explanation. There was no wind or breeze strong enough in the house. Even the AC was from a small window unit. It couldn't have possibly been that. The next thing I heard scared the absolute crap out of me, and I can still to this day hear it when I think about it. Something right in my ear whispered my name. Jake. Immediately I said, "Bill, stop messing with me. I know that's you." I got up and went to the stairs, looking down, and no one was there. No one was around at all. Everyone was still getting their plates for dinner. So, who said my name? Something definitely called my name in my sister's room. I still get the creeps when I think about it. Demon Possession from BlueSteel. I live in Oklahoma, a state with a very large evangelical Christian population. My family and I used to go to a small Pentecostal church, but we now go to a Southern Baptist church. I've many fond memories of our old church, though. The people there were very warm and friendly, and practically treated you like family. Visitors were greeted with a smile and a handshake, and were often invited to have dinner after Sunday night service. However, this one memory will always stick with me. Our church often has visitors coming and going, usually people that just moved to the area and are trying out different churches to see which one they wanted us to stick with. We also get visitors that live rough lifestyles and are trying to get out of it, turning to something bigger than themselves for help. This man, let's call him Mike, was in the latter category. He lived a rough lifestyle. He never openly told us, but we know he was abusing substances, and his health was declining as a result. Mike was always pretty quiet in church. He never sang and didn't really speak to anyone. Many of us tried to drum up conversations and reach out to him, but he almost always seemed distant and wasn't very interested in talking to us. It was strange, because we're used to chatting with strangers for hours on end. But we just chalked it up to him wanting to quietly work on his faith, and we respected that. However, all of that changed one Sunday night. It was a particularly energized service. The choir was in full swing. The preacher was practically glowing with energy. The churchgoers were on their feet and heartily singing along with the choir. Mike was in his usual spot in the second front row, sitting down while everyone around him was up and singing. None of us thought it was unusual, and didn't really pay much attention to it. That is, until Mike began to growl. Yes, he was growling. We didn't notice right away, but someone next to him noticed him acting even stranger than usual and checked on him. He turned and glared at the person with an intense hatred, but it didn't look like Mike. It was like someone or something else had taken control of his facial expressions. That person was startled, and that's when others around him started to notice. The preacher saw the commotion starting to build and came down from the pulpit to see what was going on. As the preacher drew closer, Mike turned to stare at him with that same hateful look. The preacher was equally startled, but he must have known or felt what was happening, and so he signaled his deacons to come assist him. Mike continued to stare and growl as they gathered around him and put their hands on him. When they started praying, Mike's eyes rolled back in his head, and he began to foam at the mouth, gnashing his teeth. One of the deacons instructed the rest of the churchgoers to go into the parking lot. As the preacher and his deacons prayed over Mike, he kept foaming at the mouth, his eyes still rolled back in his head. He also began to convulse, and the man gathered around him felt a powerful and hateful presence. The preacher ended the prayer with a command to the demon to leave Mike in the name of Jesus Christ. At this, Mike fell to the floor, unconscious. After a few minutes, he woke up crying. He said he had felt a powerful energy around him, but not a hateful one. This was love. The preacher instructed the deacons to meet the rest of us churchgoers at our usual dinner spot, and he would stay and talk with Mike. Mike opened up that night, spilling everything going on in his life to the preacher. I don't know much about what happened to Mike after that. He did come back a few more Sundays, and we did notice he was a lot happier and more energetic. As far as I know, he started going to a different church when he moved to another city. I hope he's still doing all right. Even thinking about that event still chills me to the bone. I'd been having doubts before about my faith, but watching and feeling that much evil and hatred has definitely solidified it. The thought that demonic beings really do inhabit our world terrifies me, and I don't know how I would be able to cope with it without my faith. Please, be careful with what you introduce into your lives, because you may just end up inviting something in that is truly the stuff of nightmares.